stream is up. Make sure this is where I want it to be. Great. Go ahead and close that because I don't want that to act up. And that's gonna, yep. All right. So any questions from y'all before we start? Just a reminder, the first paper is due in like 3 weeks, so still plenty of time. Obviously for y'all here, if you're able to print it out and bring it in, that'd be great. For the rest of my class online, just make sure you send it to me via my email, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But yeah, that's still got it several weeks before that's even a concern. Okay. Yeah, we're almost done with this chapter already. So let's finish chapter 5, I guess. We talked about Augustus. This was really the beginning of the Roman Empire. Things were chaotic, and people wanted stability and peace, and Octavian was able to give them that, but in response, or in return, he took over. He gave himself the title Augustus, which also becomes sort of a title going forward, but still not quite as prominent as Caesar. Created Praetorian Guard, which we're going to see a lot of going forward as well. And while technically the Senate was brought back, it was very much a tool that was wielded by the emperor. So we have Augustus here with the creepy little cherub baby that implies, some connection to divinity. Praetorian Guard, which also have creepy little faces on their armor. Where's my mouse? I'm not a fan of that. So, the empire continued the system of bringing in whatever gods that were of the people they conquered. However, this actually started to cause people to question their old ways of religion. So Augustus is just like, screw it, let's get rid of the old stuff and just do something new. And the new system was you worship the emperor. Specifically, that Caesar had himself become a god, and typically after an emperor died, they were seen as ascending to godhood and become part of that whole thing. That said, those in the East who were, part of, say, the former Persian Empire that was used to their ruler being seen as divine, went ahead and worshiped the Roman emperor. But for the most part, which, again, like everything else we've talked about with Rome, this was how it was supposed to be, where you don't consider the emperor divinity until after they're gone. For the most part, Jews were tolerated in Rome. However, they would often get in fights with the Greeks, and this, of course, led them to be seen as causing trouble because, again, one of the constants of history is that the Jews are going to be treated poorly. In 66 BCE, they rebelled in Jerusalem. And the Emperor Titus sent the Roman legions to put it down, and then they looted the city just because it was there. Of course, as during the time of the emperors, we get the emergence of Christianity. But for the most part, they ignored it because it was seen as just being a superstition branching off from Judaism, not really a proper religion. Because for the most part, it was, hey, this dude that we follow died, but he came back. The Roman authority was like, yeah, all right. Well, whatever you guys are into. So here we have Julius Caesar becoming divinity. The sack of Jerusalem, which besides just looting the place, I mean, chucking people off of these high steps onto what is basically rock. Although this dude's not even going to let him hit the ground first. So in many of the engravings of the period, they like to show off their conquests. And this one was clearly the looting of Jerusalem because, you know, you've got the menorah here. Those tended to not be anywhere else but, you know, Hebrew regions. So once Augustus died, the initial line of emperors were from his family. The Claudian lines. So we had Tiberius. He restored some of the Senate's powers, but wasn't really into hanging out in Rome. He instead went to the island of Capri and stayed there because it was a nice island out in the Mediterranean. He delegated rule to a soldier named Sejanus, who eventually got himself murdered because apparently Sejanus wasn't doing a very good job. Also, there was this whole thing with, like, Capri being basically one big island orgy all the time. And this was where Caligula was raised. Tiberius was Caligula's, I want to say, like, uncle, but had all of Caligula's family murdered basically in front of him, and then kept him on a very tight leash. So by the time Caligula came to power, he was already pretty much mentally broken. Over the course of Caligula's reign, here we are. He, let's see, seduced his sisters, wanted to make his favorite horse a senator, had a shrine dedicated to himself in which the clothes of the statue had to be changed based on what he was wearing, among other things. Caligula, this one in particular, having a shrine dedicated to him while he's still alive, that was seen as a no-no, but obviously we're doing that anyway. He was, well, I mean, incestuous stuff in Rome wasn't that uncommon, especially among the royalty, so this was happening. This one in particular, he basically told the senators that they were so dumb that his horse could be a senator, and so he proceeded to, like, bring his horse into the Senate. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard got rid of him. Again, if you recall, the Praetorian Guard was specifically there to keep the emperor safe, but I guess they decided that the emperor was causing so much trouble for Rome they needed to get rid of him. I guess you could say, while the Praetorian Guard certainly wasn't doing their stated job, it could be said that they were taking their job as protecting Rome from the emperor. So, depending on how you see it. So here's Tiberius in Capri. We've got, it was a raunchy place to be. And then Caligula getting shanked by his bodyguard. They also, let's see, do I actually? Yeah, so once Caligula was killed, the Praetorian Guard went around and murdered the rest of his family because it's seen as the evil extends to the family, including the children. They did the old biblical method of grabbing the children by the ankles and smashing their head against the wall. However, the member of Caligula's family that didn't kill was Claudius. Claudius was Caligula's uncle, I think. And while the Praetorian Guard was going around murdering the rest of Caligula's family, Claudius was found. Let's see. No, it doesn't actually say. Claudius was Caligula's uncle. Claudius was found hiding behind a curtain in the royal palace, just expecting to get killed. And the Praetorian Guard was like, "Hey, you're the only one left. You're emperor now." So he's remembered poorly by his contemporaries. He had a stammer, and that's often seen as a mental defect, even though that's just, you can't get your words out. But he was a lot better than Caligula, by far. It was during his reign that Rome conquered Britain, Mauritania, and Thrace, and he was a fairly decent emperor. I mean, he wasn't great. He wasn't, Augustus, but he was certainly better than what they'd had. However, he married a woman who already had a child, the child being Nero, and his natural-born son, basically he wanted Nero and his natural-born son to rule jointly. Nero's mother decided she didn't like that idea, so she poisoned Claudius and eventually had the natural-born son killed as well, which leads to Nero. Nero is very well known. Now, that said, early in his reign, things went pretty well. There was a literate renaissance, but someone tried to kill Nero, and his paranoia took over. So many of the great writers during this time period were forced to commit suicide because they had spoken out against Nero. Usually not to the extent of, we need to get rid of this guy, but poking fun at him. And that was enough for Nero to be like, hey, this is now treason, even though you did this before all that happened. You can kill yourself or we'll kill you. He then went on to poison Claudius' son. That was, his half-brother, I guess step-brother, that was sort of technically also heir to the throne. Married Claudius' daughter, who again was, I guess, technically his stepfather, but then he had her killed. Kicked one of his mistresses to death, who, by the way, was pregnant, and eventually had his mother killed which, to be fair, his mother was crazy and abusive as well, and used seduction to get Nero to do what she wanted. So there was also a lot of incest there. He eventually committed suicide as Roman soldiers closed in to get rid of him because he knew his time was at an end. Now, Nero is famous for, quote, fiddling while Rome burned. He did play a lyre, but he wasn't in Rome when Rome had the big fire. However, he did use this to his advantage and took all of the land that was freed up by the city burning down to build this massive palace to himself. And also there was this huge Colossus statue he had built of himself. And after Nero was killed and the Romans tore his castle down, or his palace down, they didn't really know what to do with all that land, and that's actually where the Colosseum was built. And it was called as such because everyone remembered this colossal statue of Nero, hence the name Colosseum. So here we have Claudius not wanting to die, and the Praetorian Guard, still wet with the blood of all the other people they killed, like, oh no, we're not going to kill you. And this is the, supposed image of him enjoying himself while Rome burned around him, which again is due to later propaganda by, once the Christians came to power, they remembered Nero as being extremely awful and wanted to blame him for everything because, to be fair, it was really easy to put the blame of the fire on the Christians because in the Roman days in particular, if you asked someone if they were Christian and they obviously would tell you, otherwise they would be betraying their faith. And so he just said, well, the Christians did it. So if you ask someone if they're Christian, they're basically admitting to having done the fire, which is why once the Christians came to power, they were like, all right, screw this guy. We're going to blame the fire on him. The end result, we don't actually know who did the fire. It might have just been a natural, well, not a natural disaster, but like an accident that spread beyond what anyone was able to control, more than likely. Like, it's pretty doubtful that the emperor, despite being Nero, would be like, let's burn down the city so I can build stuff, because that's going to hurt the economy. And, I mean, he's still the emperor. Anyway, after these psychopaths, a general seized control, Flavinius. The Senate elected a new senator, elected a senator named Nerva to the post of the emperor, which would lead to the good emperors. We had 5 emperors who were older, childless, and put the state first. So they didn't have any kids to, create this dynasty. They were older men, so they tended to be less ambitious. They'd already typically served within the Senate and had been working for the good of Rome their whole lives, and they would choose their successor based on merit as opposed to being related to them, which was typically a better way of doing things, because the whole dynastic bloodline thing has never worked. So after Flavinius, we had Trajan. He expanded the empire to the greatest size that Rome ever reached, conquered Dacia and Persia. After Trajan was Hadrian, who actually pulled back a little bit from these conquests because, when you conquer land, you have to not just conquer it, but pacify it and fold it into the empire, and then also garrison the frontier. So Hadrian pulled back a little bit so as to better defend the empire, standardize Roman law among provinces, and not only chose the guy who would be emperor after him, but also the guy who would be emperor after the guy he chose. So he chose his successor and also the next guy, which is really assuming that the next guy is going to live longer than the previous guy, but whatever. Antonius Pius was this first guy. The book doesn't go into much detail about him. He was a bureaucrat. He was considered a good emperor, so cool. Antonius Pius. And then Marcus Aurelius. He fought the Germans and rounded out the five good emperors because, unfortunately, Aurelius had a kid and decided, oh, my kid can take over, and his kid was garbage. So we'll get to that in a moment. So here we have Flavian. This is this is obviously in Italy. I forget what it's called. It's a specific type of tower that they would build to commemorate their victories because, while you probably can't see it here, up close, it's lots and lots of like bas-reliefs of the various victories that were done during Trajan's rule, which, again, Trajan pushed the empire as far as it would ever get. So there was lots of conquests. So you can see, guys, here, looting stuff, there's battles, slaves being taken, soldiers, just all sorts of stuff, all the way up this tower, which is really impressive considering, ancient Rome. Hadrian, I remember really well because of Hadrian's Wall. So in England, or Britain, at Britannia, I should say, the Romans had established the various small. I think they might have established London, or was that might have been a Viking thing. Anyway, so Romans were here and they kept trying to push north, but then they hit the Scots, which is to say at the time the Picts, Picts, who were a very aggressive tribe of Anglo-Saxon. Well, not even Anglo-Saxon. They were pre-Anglo-Saxon. Basically, Rome decided they weren't going to deal with the Picts and literally built a wall to not deal with the people up here, which I find amusing. Do I have an image of Hadrian's Wall? I don't. Damn. Hadrian's Wall it's not like the Great Wall of China where it's really, really tall and really, really wide. It's only, for the most part, about 4 or 5 feet tall, and then they had guard towers. But if the only military you have are dudes on foot and maybe some horses, a 5-foot stone wall with guard posts is enough to prevent a mass onrush of people. So it was enough as a major guard post, and it's still there. You can still go and see Hadrian's Wall today. Obviously, after 2,000 years, it is very much diminished in size, but it's still very much there. It's pretty cool. And then here we have Marcus Aurelius. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. He was a Stoic. We briefly mentioned those the various Roman ideas before this point, where he just lived his life by what can be done to better the world. So Marcus Aurelius was a pretty good dude. Unfortunately, like I said, he decided his son would be a good emperor and was mistaken. So yeah, that's actually it for chapter 5. The empire wasn't necessarily better than the republic, but it was necessary to maintain the vast amount of land that Rome had conquered. And while all the various changes that Caesar instituted was too much too fast for at least the senators in Rome, it did allow, well, first, oh, nuts, I forgot his name. Mark Antony, there we go. And then later, Augustus to reform Rome and create the empire. So again, Caesar technically wasn't an emperor. I mean, he was in all but name, but technically he wasn't. And while the first rulers of this empire were awful, because, well, Romans did not know how to rule with absolute power, we did eventually have the stable, good emperors that showed that, hey, if you're not inbred and insane and, are working for the good of Rome, then you might be a decent emperor. It's just that there was a lot of potential for corruption. And considering how much corruption we already had in the Republic, it wasn't great. But Rome would still last several more centuries, so, they had all of that. And they would very much shape how Europe would be. So, that's actually it for chapter 5. I have 6 ready. The shift from ancient to medieval, or the full title, The Slow Turn from Ancient to Medieval. And this has quite a few interesting things going on. So the 3 things that created the early Middle Ages, late Roman civilization, because again, even after, say, Rome falls, you still have people who consider themselves Romans living throughout Europe, and their civilization stuck around, their culture stuck around. Christianity growing throughout Rome, which again we'll see here pretty soon once we get to Constantine. And then the Germans, the folks to the north and east of Rome. And, well, we'll get into why they were where they were a little bit later. So these met and often didn't get along so well inside the late Roman Empire. And again, this really does create what will become the Middle Ages, as well as, in a lot of ways, Europe. So there was about 100 years of complete anarchy. Again, once Marcus Aurelius died, his son took over. Commodus was not well liked. Yeah. There's an image in the book of Commodus, a marble statue of Marcus Aurelius' son and heir as the mythological strawman Hercules. It's him standing there. He's got like a club and like an animal pelt over his head. Commodus' flirtation with the gladiatorial life, extreme self-indulgence, and poor judgment eventually led to his assassination. So once again, didn't go so well for the emperor. In fact, over the next, let's see, well, we'll get that in a minute. So for the next century, there was no like real strong emperor. People were, we'll see here in a little bit, emperors were getting killed in really high numbers because they were garbage. And as far as Rome was concerned, if you weren't doing best for Rome, you need to not be here. Eventually, in 284, Diocletian came to power and used the military to reorganize Rome, and also like made Rome more of a military empire than it had been before. Uh, yeah, before the army was a tool of the state, now the state was a tool of the army. The army was in control, and the government was just sort of there to do its bidding, really. However, this meant that most emperors going forward were generals, and you could only really be a general if you had been fighting in the provinces, which is like the outskirts of the Roman Empire, which further meant that these people would be less Latin, less Roman than most of the people in Rome. You would just have a general coming in from like near the Germanic states or over in Persia and be like, I'm in charge now. I don't actually speak Latin. So it was difficult going forward. Also, economic instability. Obviously, when your entire empire is essentially just an arm of the army, that's going to be a lot of money going to the army. And they even debased the coin value, which meant they went from basically gold to silver. Or maybe from silver to bronze. I don't think they actually went to gold. Probably silver to bronze. Or copper, I guess I should say. For some reason, this is the only thing I could find for Diocletian, so there's Diocletian. It was weird. Yeah. This next section is called Emperors Come and Go, dozens of them, and I just said it's tough being the emperor. Yeah, in 50 years after Marcus Aurelius died, there was 9 emperors, only one of whom died of natural causes. Most were generals who cheated and killed their way to the top, and so someone typically got rid of them. Again, oftentimes the Praetorian Guard. In the year 238 alone, 6 people tried to become emperor. And I get the whole, like, having basically unlimited and unchecked power, but when you look back and see how many of your predecessors had been assassinated, usually by the people who were literally made to keep them safe, I wouldn't want to be emperor. If somebody came to me, it's like, hey, so-and-so died and you're the next best candidate for emperor, I'd be like, go get somebody else. No, man, not at all. Which, again, typically by this point, if you were going to be considered emperor, you'd be a general, you'd already be really ambitious, but it's like, nah, man, I'm going to stay over here in my corner and, rule over whatever section I'm ruling over already, because, again, they wouldn't just grab people off the street, but no, absolutely not. And while things were bad within Rome, there was also lots of people outside of Rome that wanted to take Rome down a notch. Persia was pressing in from the east because, again, after Hadrian, they had pulled back a little bit, so Persia still sort of exists. We had the Germanic tribes in the north. In the year 251, Emperor Decius died fighting the Goths. His successor was captured in the east, and the city of Antioch fell, Antioch being like a major city in the Middle East. And Aurelian had a wall built around Rome, which, again, I mentioned this way back at the beginning of a Roman Republic chapter. That wasn't something that Romans were cool with. It was seen as no longer being secure. Basically, building a wall around the city implied that the city was no longer secure. Because, like, oh, we need a wall to keep our enemies out? What about the whole freaking empire? It would be like building walls around each individual city here in the United States. That would make it feel like we're not secure. Rather than, oh, we're building a wall for our security. It's like, no, Rome's wall is their army. Which was actually a similar thing with Sparta. For example, Sparta didn't have a wall like most Greek city-states did, because in their mind, their warriors were their wall. So same sort of idea here. So technically Christianity was illegal in Rome, but I mean every other religion was illegal in Rome. You had to worship the emperors or you were worshiping the wrong people. But depending on the emperor, it was either tolerated or they actually made a point of persecuting it. So it was like, whoever's in charge gets to decide whether you can do what you want or not. So some early Christian stuff. Most of their doctrine was oral, but by the 3rd and 4th centuries, they actually started writing stuff down. And specifically, historically, they used a codex, which is like a bound book, rather than papyrus scrolls, which most other groups used because they were more common. There was also the Gnostics, who were Christians that had, differing views on theology. Gnostic just means like, I think it's Latin for just like knowing things. Like an agnostic is just like they don't know if there is or isn't divine forces. So a Gnostic in the Christian sense is just like a group. There's like another group of Christians, because obviously over the course of several hundred years, the thought process had shifted among the various Christians. It was no longer just like what Paul had put in place. Well, obviously all this opinion led to a need among many Christian leaders to have an orthodoxy. So like what books were accepted into Scripture, what books were considered non-canonical. There's a lot of weird, like, apocryphal books that aren't in the Bible, or not in, say, our Protestant Bible, but other groups use, other orthodoxies use. There's some weird stuff in there. So, the book goes into a bit more detail here. Christianity had a few main differences from previous religions, and the book puts it in B's, so I guess that's an easy mnemonic device. Bishops, which were their religious leaders, as opposed to like a priest or oh nuts, what's the Jewish religious leader? I can't remember the term. But, different. They specifically had bishops. Again, they would use the codex or a book as opposed to oral traditions or, using scrolls. The early Christian churches were basilicas, which I'll show you what a basilica looks like if you haven't seen one, as opposed to temples or the synagogues that the Jews used. And most pagans cremated their dead, whereas Christians very specifically buried theirs. Now, I say most pagans. It depended on the group. There's plenty of pagan burials throughout Europe, but at the time, burying your dead was seen as something different. So bishops saw themselves as direct heirs to the apostles. Each of them could trace their authority back to one of the apostles. In theory, they were equal, but obviously, if you're a bishop in a large city, later called archbishops, you had more power because you had more people under your control. I mean, a bishop in, say, London would have more power than, say, a bishop in some, backwoods little village. And specifically, using this idea of bishops being descendants of, or direct heirs to the apostles, or they're not descendants, not like blood descendant. The Petrine authority. So in Matthew 16, 18, and 19, Jesus said that Peter would be the rock upon which he would build the church. The bishops of Rome argued that they were the lineage of Peter. Therefore, they had authority over all the other archbishops, which is why, like Rome, as like we have today, the papal states. Well, not the papal states, just the papal palace, was seen as being descended directly from Peter. Actually, I think this is. Yeah, this is the donation of Constantine, which turns out was fake. But this is where, we'll see Constantine in a little bit, is like giving all this land and power to the papacy. But it turns out that that wasn't a thing, but that's more next semester. So here we have some of the very early bound books, obviously using string or rope to tie them together. And they were very, very narrow, these early books. Here's a basilica. If you've ever been, well, this is more like, this is closer to Greek Orthodox style than the more Roman Catholic. But you still have the aisle, still have the idea of the nave in the middle, and then the various aisles off to the sides, which once we get into like high Catholicism will be where you put the various altars to the saints. If you've never been in like a Catholic church, they're really cool. Like just architecturally, it's pretty interesting stuff. But this was very different from how most of the buildings, particularly the religious buildings in Rome, were built. And here we of course have various burials. This is where you get to the question of how old does something have to be where it's considered archaeology instead of grave robbing, because these are just open graves now, which, to be fair, like it happens a lot in Italy. You just be digging in your backyard and suddenly you're hitting something from 2,000 years ago. In fact, I think there was a McDonald's in Italy that was like breaking ground and they ran into like an ancient burial thing. And I guess it was a part of Italy where they try to keep stuff where it is rather than like move it to a museum. So that particular McDonald's would have either had to completely get rid of their construction and go somewhere else, or what they ended up doing is they built the McDonald's anyway, and then where the grave was found, they've got like a glass, like a viewing thing basically. So you can be standing in line at McDonald's and look down into like this 2,000 plus year old grave. It's crazy living on top of all this stuff. So yeah, there's the Petrine authority, Jesus giving the literal big-ass keys to the church to Peter. You can actually tell from the art here, this is very much Renaissance era art, not early Middle Ages art, because hoo boy, that's some stuff. Okay. So back to Diocletian. So moving back to that previous slide of Diocletian. Once he came to power, he did his best to bring order back to Rome and created regional authorities. So he created the Tetrarchy, which again, if you know any Latin at all, tetra means four. And archy, that's like rulership, so it's a system of four rulers. Easy. So you had two senior rulers, the Augusti, and two junior rulers, the Caesars, who basically split Rome, split the empire, and ruled different sections of it, so you wouldn't just have one dude trying to rule it all and get himself killed. So they split the empire in half, essentially. So one Augustus and one Caesar, two each. The Augustus was the one in charge, and the Caesar would be like his subordinate. So this wasn't quite the same as the consuls, but it's kind of back in that vein. So yeah, they would have east and west, split the powers to lessen the assassinations and also more directly control the empire. And I have, I'm pretty sure I have a map of, actually, yeah, I've got a map of what that looked like. Split the empire into 96 provinces, so each region was split up into, like what we have here with the states. Created the army, or rebuilt the army, new hierarchies of merit rather than rulings of birth and heritage. So if you were good at your job, you could get a higher job, as opposed to, oh, you're of this such and such family, you have no particular skills, but you have royal or good lineage, therefore you can be a senator or whatever. This is known as meritocracy, essentially, is that you get a job because you're good at it, which is wild, I know. He also wanted to standardize Roman religion because, again, depending on the emperor would be what was persecuted and what was allowed. So he did lead to a renewed persecution of Christianity, but this wouldn't last terribly long. Because we have here, this was how it was split up. So you had in Augustus here, in Italy, Northern Africa, and Spain. I don't know why this wasn't just one thing, but whatever. Oh, I know why, because they did more traveling by ocean than they did by road, and this is mountains. You didn't come through here. This was easier to get to from here than it was from up here. This is a lot of awful mountainous region. Anyway, so you had Maximian as Augustus here, his Caesar, Constantius in Gaul and Britain, because again, Britain, they were mostly just down here. Whereas, let's see, Diocletian as Augustus was way over here, which actually becomes important later. So rather than Augustus being in charge of, Diocletian being in charge of Rome down here, not Nursia, he was actually over here. And then his Caesar, Galerius, was in the Greek area here. Why would Diocletian choose to put his rulership over here? And the district capital was Nicodemia, which, I mean, you guys probably don't, that's not super important. But why would the guy who was putting all this together choose to be over here as opposed to in the middle of Rome? Do you remember what we talked about earlier with the importance of like the eastern section of the empire? There was a lot of money to be made over here. So he put his capital over here because this is actually where all the economy was happening. Rome still existed as Rome, but all of this over here is just like frontier land. You're fighting the Germans, whatever. Rome still exists, but this is where everything's happening. You also didn't really want to be here because the Greeks were always rebelling, and let's not deal with that. This is where all the economy was happening. In particular, Byzantium, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. Oh, and this image is in the book. It's a porphyry sculpture in Venice. The four tetrarchs are shown in pairs, each pair, and Augustus embraces the Caesar to show their common purpose and the nature of their relationship. Pairs of tetrarchs also signal that one pair governed half and the other pair the other half. So yeah, again, it was like the consuls, but expanded. And then it immediately fell apart. Diocletian and Maximian stepped down, and rather than a new tetrarchy take over, Constantius, the Caesar over in Britain, died but had not specifically left Constantine as heir. So Constantine took the rational approach and took the army and sparked a civil war. As we've seen, that's a pretty common thing now. Poor Diocletian, like after 100 years, like, oh, I'm going to make things stable, and then immediately falls apart once he's done. In the year 312, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine defeated Maxentius. More importantly, though, he fought under a Christian banner. We're still not entirely sure why. There's all sorts of various theories. Obviously, the one that the Roman Catholic Church really likes is that he had like a priest with him as one of his advisors, and he advised that Constantine fight under the banner of the Christian God. But again, we're not sure. But basically, he decided before this battle that I guess the other gods hadn't been helping him, and the normal religion of the emperors wouldn't really help him because he's turning against the old way of Rome. So I guess he was like, hey, if we win this battle, we'll chalk it up to the Christian God. And they won the battle. It's like, all right, well, it was the Christian God what did it. So after this, he and Licinius, who was another rival for the throne, issued the Edict of Milan, created official toleration for Christians, and reversed the various anti-Christian laws that had been in place. Now, this isn't yet Constantine creating a Christian Rome, but we're getting there. Here we have a really incorrect image of the conversion of Constantine. For one, the symbol for Christianity at the time was not a cross, but I think it was like an X, which was the Greek for the letter chi, C-H-I, which was the first part of Christ. So the symbol that they put on their shields was an X, not a cross. Also, this armor is so not Roman. And he's got a cape that's the flag of like Austria, which, to be fair, Austria was like the center of the Holy Roman Empire, which would be created after this, but like centuries after Constantine was dead. It's so just out of place, but I don't know, it's funny. But it's just like, this is a medieval rendition of something that happened in the late Roman Empire. It's just real weird. Now, to be fair, the angel here in red, that was usually how, I think, the Archangel Michael was depicted. The various archangels had very specific depictions in Catholic lore. I think this was Michael. So, now that Constantine has basically yoked himself with the Christian God, we can't have all these various pagan temples in Rome. And they basically have to tear down all of Rome and rebuild it to get rid of all the various structures in Rome. So Constantine's like, screw it, I'm going to make my own capital. So he did. Excuse me. Ooh. So by 330, he had created a capital in Byzantine, which he renamed Constantinople, because of course he did. This was considered the new Rome, the new city of Rome. The empire still around. Now they did build all the old structures, the Forum, the Senate, etc., but no pagan temples were allowed. So as head of the empire, Constantine was also head of the church. He settled this dispute about the nature of Christ, whether he was equal or subordinate to God. This was actually where, this was where the idea of the Trinity came about. It's not actually in the Bible, or at least not in like the translations before Nicaea. It was added later by Catholic monks. But it did clarify what a lot of various Christian orthodoxies were arguing about. And then at the Council of Nicaea, specifically in 325, this was where the books of the Bible, at least again in Catholic lore, were decided upon. So they took all the various books that were considered to be part of the Bible and decided which ones fit and which ones they threw out. So this is actually when the Bible became like a single thing, because before, it's like, 60-something books? You had the Torah, the Old Testament, but the New Testament was just like a bunch of scattered, testaments, a bunch of scattered ideas and books and whatnot, and letters, especially from Paul, that were eventually gathered and put together here. And of course, many of them were considered not canon and tossed out. Revelation actually barely made it in at the end of this council, because Revelation, if you look at like the rest of the Bible, and then Revelation's different. So here is Byzantium, which again will be Constantinople. It's Istanbul. It's modern-day Istanbul. It's right here on this little bit of land between modern-day Turkey and modern-day Greece. Again, Rome over here. It still exists, but this is where all the power is now. And you can see where they're spreading. And then by 117, they spread over here. Which this is, I mean, we're, 14 and 117. We're in like the 300s now. So we are well into AD/CE. And there's, of course, there's Hadrian's Wall again. He's just like, we're not going. We're not dealing with the Picts. So, Constantine died in 337, and his 3 sons took over. But obviously they couldn't share a massive freaking empire and ended up murdering each other until Constantius II was now in power, named after his late grandfather. His cousin Julian was in charge of fighting the Germans. However, in 361, Julian renounced Christianity and was named an apostate. And that's not something good. That's the equivalent of being like an outlaw in the Old West, which essentially meant that you were no longer protected by God's law. So if someone were to kill you, they wouldn't be subject to any punishment. So in response to being labeled an apostate, he decided he was going to march on Constantinople. Because again, if you don't agree with the empire, just get an army. Before he got there, though, Constantius died. So, based on lineage, this dude who was considered an apostate and an enemy of the empire is now the emperor. However, due to the entrenchment of Christianity within Roman tradition by this point, Julian was not able to turn Rome back into the anti-Christian society it had once been. So despite the emperor not being Christian and like literally having renounced Christianity and nearly started a war over it, Christianity was so much a part of Roman tradition that they couldn't do anything about it. And within 30 years, Emperor Theodosius was leading state-sponsored eradication of pagan religions, which we'll also see a lot more of in a little while. So yeah, the empire was now inextricably linked to Christianity. And despite a rather aggressive changeover here with the emperor, it wasn't going anywhere. Now, the next section are the Germans, but we're actually like halfway through this chapter already. So, we'll end it here. If I don't have chapter 6 up on Blackboard yet, I'll do that like right here in a minute. I guess I'm technically going to have to put the study guide up too, because this is chapter 6. So, I mean, obviously it's not going to be, I don't think we'll be doing the study guide on Wednesday, because again, we're about halfway through now, so we'll probably be able to.
Come on Wednesday.
Well, we'll probably be finishing this Wednesday. But next Monday we'll probably be doing the study guide. So, yeah. Okay, that'll do it for this. I don't want to jump into the German tribes with just a little bit of time left because there's a lot to talk about with the Germanic tribes. So yeah, that's